Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and the wonderful Kim Farnell. Hello, Kim.
Hi, Anna.
It's lovely to have you back.
Thank you. It's great to be back as well.
And this time we are talking about your new book, The True History of Sun Sign Astrology.
That's it.
And I just thought, what a bold title, The True History of Sun Sign Astrology.
It's actually quite an easy title because there isn't another history of Sun Sign Astrology. So there's not actually anyone to contradict about it because there are histories of astrology, obviously. There's loads of histories of astrology. And there's histories of other things that are related that put bits of astrological history in them. But no one's actually collected all the sun sign and popular astrology stuff through history together. So it is the only one at the moment. I could have called it the only history of sun sign astrology, but then all it takes is someone to write a new book in a few months' time and I'd look rather silly. So we thought this was better.
Well, I love it. I love the boldness of it. I think it's a very bold title, and I love that. So, well, tell us about the true history of sun sign astrology.
Oh, in a few words. Well, there's a whole book about it there, but basically, it goes right back to the beginning of astrology in the Babylonians. And the premise of the book is that sun sign astrology and popular astrology, as we know it, is not a new thing. It's always been there in the background. There are times when it was more popular and more known. There were times when it was less known, but it's always been around. Because one thing we need to remember is that although there were periods when what we think of as some people describe as real astrology or nativities or whatever, are more popular and more to the forefront, there was always a large proportion of people that wouldn't actually know their birth time. They might not even know their birth date accurately, but they would still want some sort of astrological reading or astrological understanding. So the only way you could effectively do that, well, there were two ways, is to know your sun sign, the way we do it. The alternative way, which some people did do, is to know what day of the week you were born. So you would choose the ruling planet for that day, and you would be, if you're born on a Wednesday, for example, which ruled by Mercury, you'd be a child of Mercury. So you would look at all things mercurial. But people who didn't know their date of birth quite often didn't know their day of birth either. So obviously sun signs were, and always have been, a lot more accessible. And if you look at older texts going back as far as you like, there are descriptions, character descriptions of people born under the different signs, which are fairly consistent throughout. One of the reasons that we don't always see it, though, is because the language has shifted. People didn't use the word horoscope in the way we do now, for example, because nowadays, if you talk about someone's horoscope, you're talking about a 12 sign thing, you're usually talking about a sun sign based thing. You know what type of astrology we're talking about. Or if you're more into astrology, you might be talking about casting a birth chart. We still know what we're talking about. But the word horoscope wasn't used like that for a very long time. Although the dictionary tells you it means birth chart, it was quite often a synonym for forecast or prediction. So you would have the weather horoscope or the fashion horoscope. You had a lot of fashion horoscopes in the 19th century, or the social horoscope and other such terms. So it's quite easy for sun sign astrology to sort of disappear from view because we weren't using the same words to describe it. Pardon me.
Well, I mean, it makes so much sense, actually, because all you need to think about is human nature. And actually, we like to think we're so much more sophisticated, that we've evolved so much, into our time. But you only need to read literature to realize we haven't fundamentally changed that much in terms of human nature. And so I can completely see how Sun Sign Astrology, because of its accessibility to the person who wouldn't necessarily know their birth date, let alone their birth time, would be very appealing. And the fact that it speaks to the archetypes, which is, you know, ancient psychology, of course, it's going to have an appeal throughout the ages.
There's a lovely quote in a 19th century newspaper I found recently, which from it's 1921, I believe, but sorry, not 19th century, but anyway, the point being, this is the period when psychology is coming to the fore, and it gets mixed with things like astrology and other practices, obviously. And it's a suggestion that psychology ought to be covered by the Vagrancy Act, because it's fortune telling by the unconscious. In other words, there is no difference. Even people who opposed astrology saw psychology and astrology as different ways of describing the same thing. So that idea goes way back.
Yes, well, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, even just going off topic slightly, the humors are descriptive of personality as well. You know, so this is something that we've always sought to do, is to understand ourselves, understand each other, understand what makes people tick. And so Sun Sign Astrology, however broad a stroke it might present, is still going to offer something.
Yeah, it also, it's worth saying, also gets hidden, because that sort of astrology, the popular astrology, is less likely to be the sort of astrology that books are written about. And a lot of histories of astrology and astrological practice, which obviously aren't quite the same thing, are centered around middle-aged men in London, from the 18th century onwards. Well, no, maybe from the 16th century onwards, and about what these men in London, or occasionally Bristol, I'm not quite sure why Bristol, but Bristol features a lot, what these particular groups of men were doing. But of course, this is just part of the country, one group of people. And sun sign astrology and mass astrology is actually more likely to be practiced by women in this country, at least, and probably in other countries, but I haven't looked at that, so I couldn't say that. But certainly in Britain and Ireland, the practitioners tend to be women. So we're talking about less educated people, people who don't write things down as much, and people who are marginalized anyway. So it starts disappearing from records.
Well, funny you should say that, because as we've been speaking, I just have this image of the wife of Bath be talking about her Aries temperament and what that meant. And so here's Chaucer portraying a normal, everyday woman, actually talking about astrology and her temperament through it. So this really is something that goes back, and we can see it in our literature.
Yeah, and Chaucer as well, is he uses the astrology in a way that assumes people have at least a basic understanding of it. He assumes the reader knows what he's talking about, because he doesn't give detailed explanations. I mean, it's not difficult to understand, obviously, without knowledge of astrology. You can work your way through it. But he starts from the point that people know this already. They will recognize what he's saying. When he says, oh, she's an Aries, they will click. Yes, he can go on and add more description, but people know it. So people obviously had an awareness, because otherwise, why would he be writing in that way?
They had to, because not only does she talk about that sun sign, maybe it was Mars in Aries or something, but or Mars connected with the sun or something, but there's definitely an Aries reference, and the color red associated with, you know, and what she was doing was she was explaining why she is the way she is, you know, the number of husbands she'd had, and the fact that, you know, she was
very lively, wasn't she?
She was lusty, you know, she was a I want what I want kind of woman. and that's all there in that one sentence where she makes that reference. So it's, and I just can't get past this connection of what you said about women and the fact that he portrayed exactly that side of female nature, you know, wanting to understand and seeing the connection with the sun.
Related to that as well is that we have a tendency nowadays to put things in little boxes. So you do astrology, or you do this, or you do psychology, or you do that, and everything is seen as separate. Whereas until relatively recently, people saw these things as interrelated and connected. So someone who was called a fortune teller, for example, could be cast in birth charts. Someone who called themselves an astrologer might only be describing character via sun signs and not doing what we think of as astrology. And because astrology, for example, was and fell under the Vagrancy Act, so it was illegal for quite a long time, and different points in history people got into trouble for it. There's records of some people who are known to have been astrologers who wrote about it, who had a lot of clients going to court and saying, I'm a graphologist, I'm a psychologist, I am anything that won't fall under the act. You can call me that. So you can't convict me under the act because I don't do that. I analyze handwriting, or I do psychology, or I took the spirits, or whatever wasn't being persecuted at that particular time. So it's not always clear who was doing the astrology and what astrology they were doing because of that. It does confuse things a bit.
Why is it that astrology attracted so much negative attention, do you think?
I don't know, it didn't attract more, it depends on who you're talking about, but it didn't attract more negative attention than equivalent time things like palmistry, for example. That had the same sort of attacks at different points. But astrology in its form that we have most of the histories about is a lot more middle class. It's a lot more about being educated. And so there's a lot of stuff attached to it that isn't attached to other practices. Palmistry for a long time was quite a working class activity. It became a society activity. And it's at that point when educated people start being involved more in it that it starts becoming something to attack, because it's affecting people who are educated. It's affecting the people who are in charge, the people who you might have running the country, or at least in important positions. When something's associated with people who are prominent and have some sort of power, then it can be a worry. There's a difference between, say, Morrison Zadkiel, who was ex-Navy, staunchly upper middle class, quite known in society circles and everything, and the woman who lives on the corner house, you know, that people know locally and pop around to see, but she's never written anything down. She knows mostly. She might have a little bookshelf, probably with a copy of Zadkiel or Raphael or a few basic things there. And she probably knows how to cast a chart, because there was a movement in the 19th century to teach more women maths. And one of the popular columns in women's magazines was basic maths and basic astronomy, which that confused my brain slightly. So it's similar to the thing about computers were all to do with women till men thought they were clever and then took them over, you know, about early computer operators all being female. It's a similar tale.
Well, I was beginning to think along class lines and whether there was an issue. But it turns out, of course, that it's precisely because the educated classes are interested that it's attracting negative attention from those who would control it. So tell us a little bit then about the evolution of the signs as we know them.
Oh, sorry, how do you mean? The meanings?
So I just mean, you know, we've got these 12 signs, and they are the basis for sun sign astrology as is being practiced. Tell us a little bit for people who are not that.
Okay, the fundamental meanings don't actually change a lot, but the way the information is put over shifts from being descriptive, which it was early on, to being prescriptive. So in earlier versions of the sun signs mean this, that, and the other, it's this person is this, they're that, they do this, they do the other. This is what they're like, so that you can walk down the street and go, oh, I can see an Aries over there. And then gradually it shifts until you start talking about the possibilities of what you can do, and it becomes addressed to you rather than them, and it starts saying you should do this, you shouldn't do that. So the biggest change, I think, in the way that sun signs presented is this descriptive to prescriptive type attitude. It's to do with a lot of things. Obviously, psychology starts emerging as a science or as a practice. I think it's better to call it a practice, so we don't argue about whether it's a science or not, because we won't get anywhere. It's also at the time when ideas such as theosophy take hold and spiritualist movement comes out. You know, a whole load of things happen around the same time. So it's not just one thing that caused that sort of shift. But if you were just reading sun sign descriptions, you would see that shift. It stops being so definite and starts telling you what you ought to do to take advantage of it. It's a very different attitude.
So it's more about understanding the possibilities and how to make the most of them.
I mean, you could argue that part of it is due to the fact that people had more possibilities, so there was more to consider. You know, your life wasn't so entrenched on this sort of narrow path, which for most people for a long time, you didn't have that many options the way you could do. I mean, some people managed to create their own options better than others, but you were still fairly limited in what you could do in life, especially if you didn't have money and the right sort of family background and that. But with people, the literacy rate goes up from the 1870s when they bring the Education Act in. The school age is made higher more than once over the next century or so. More women are educated and start entering the job market. There's options are widening for everybody. So it makes more sense to talk about you are an Aries, you might be suited to working in these sort of environments, rather than you are an Aries, you have a bad temper. I mean, you still have a bad temper, possibly, you know, you're not going to lose those things, but the emphasis shifts and it's more about what you can do. So Aries might be told you have plenty of energy, you're a go-getter, you can do things. Whereas an early Aries might be told you have a harsh temper and you tend to react too quickly, you're impulsive. It's not completely different, but the emphasis is different.
I think really what we're seeing is how society changes and in attitude in so many different ways. So as we become more about the individual making the most of things, because circumstances, as you've said, opened up, people are freer, there are more options. So that is affected in astrology and the approach that's taken, because of course every generation is going to interpret everything according to its experience and its perspective.
Yeah.
Why would astrology be otherwise?
Yeah, definitely, and it shifts. And that it's quite difficult because we have a selective history of astrology most time now. Like I said, it's certain group of middle class to upper middle class men, primarily in London. And yes, it's true, there were more people in London. Printing was primarily in London, so books tend to come there. That works as long as you ignore Scotland, of course. And the fact that Edinburgh was getting along quite nicely printing stuff and importing a lot of literature from France. There was a period where a lot of printed material coming to Scotland was French rather than English, and there was a high understanding of French at that time. So there was a big exchange, which didn't happen in the south of England. So the story in Scotland's a little bit different. I know Jane Ridder-Patrick's done a lot of work on 17th century astrology in Scotland. But that separation did actually continue into the 19th, even early 20th century. It's still a different story, which hasn't completely been covered. Because an interesting thing on that level is that one of the publishing houses for girls and women's magazines was during the 50s into the 1960s, was based in Dundee. And there were certain types of publications that were specifically coming from Scotland that we weren't quite getting in England, that affected the English press. On the simplest level, Jackie magazine, which produced horoscopes and freebies and everything to the 1964. And when it was high point, I think it was the 70s, carried on to the early 90s. And it was different to a lot of English magazines because it has a specifically Scottish base. There's a few publications like that. So there's still a lot of stuff we haven't even looked at yet. But, you know, I've gone into a fair amount of detail with this, and I'm now looking at horoscope columns specifically and the chronology of them and what they actually said. But there's still a lot missing that hasn't been looked at, and I don't have time to look at the moment. And I mean, for example, we could talk about Wales. It'll be a short conversation because I don't know that much about Welsh astrology, but we know it was there, and we know it was slightly different, and it was more tied into what cunning folk were doing in Wales than it might have been in England. So Wales has a different story again, which has, there's a lot of stuff we don't know yet. It's there, it's sort of hiding in plain sight. It's the terminology's changed, language has shifted. If you do, for example, you get on the internet, you can see all these newspapers and you type in horoscope column or whatever, you only get a limited amount of things come back because those words weren't being used in that way. So I'm gradually learning the language, so I'm starting to find more detail, but I still haven't got there yet completely.
So where are we today? Because we're living in a world that is intensely materialistic. And I'm sure you'll remember not so long ago when we were given the edict that we must always tell our clients that this is for entertainment purposes only. And yet, I feel many people at a popular level as in the average person actually still has a great deal of interest, and I would say increasingly so. So where are we in this?
I think a lot less has changed than we think. You mentioned that in general terms earlier, but in terms of just astrology and how people engage with it, the only thing that's changed substantially is that in the West, it's difficult not to know what sign you're born under nowadays. Almost everyone knows at least their sign, probably their family's sign, even if they say they know nothing about astrology. They know it because it's such a big part of our culture. And because it appears in magazines, comics, things that aimed for 8-year-olds upwards and has done since the 50s and 60s. So we feed it to children from quite a young age. So there's a bit more awareness of some of those basics than there used to be. And it's a bit more of a cultural pin. It's there all the time. But other than that, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference in how we use it, how we approach it, who uses it. It still tends to be more of a working class. If we talk about popular mass astrology and Sun Sign Astrology, it tends to be more of a working class mass media type thing. People who read the horoscope column are probably more likely to watch EastEnders than go to the opera. I mean, there's always going to be exceptions, isn't there? I mean, because that's a generalization, but on balance, it does. And that's how it has been for hundreds of thousands of years. It's that particular, the equivalent type of people. It appeals to those people.
Well, it's interesting because of all the things that I thought might come up in our conversation today, the one thing that I didn't think we were going to be talking about was class.
Yeah.
And yet it's so obviously the case.
Yeah.
And I think that we as astrologers have to be much more generous in our view of sun sign astrology because too many of us are still somewhat condemning of it.
Some of the strongest attacks on sun sign astrology over the past couple of 100 years are from astrologers. They're a lot more vitriolic. There's the tendency to use terms like real astrology for astrology that involves calculations and charts rather than sun sign equivalents, which implies that anything that you're not, if you're not doing it that way, then it's unreal. There's also the tendency to use Patrick Curry's categories, where he calls it low astrology or middle astrology or high astrology, which is really an equivalent for talking about high art or lower art. It's taken from that sort of concept, but of course it sounds like a value judgment, even though I don't think he used it in that way, but it comes over as a value judgment. So low astrology is sun sign astrology. We judge it all the time. Astrologers judge it all the time, just in the language they use to describe it, which is why I carefully try to say like mass astrology or popular astrology, because sometimes it isn't actually sun sign astrology. There's other forms mixed in with that, like moon law and practices like that, which overlap with it. So there are other forms of popular mass astrology that connect with it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be sun sign astrology, but it usually is.
I think it's really important because we need to understand that sun sign astrology is real. It is the foundation of the archetypes that we know and use, but also it's a portal. It's a means by which people begin to engage with astrology. And I think more too, you know, years ago now it was that I was asked to do a sun sign astrology column. And my first instinct was, oh no, don't go there. And then, well, never being one for saying no to a challenge, I thought, right, well, let's see what comes of this. And what came of it was a deep appreciation for it. Because what I discovered as I wrote my little paragraphs each month for each of the signs was that what I was doing might not apply to every individual of that particular sign, but I was putting my finger on the mood of the moment. And maybe that's why people do respond to it. And it's more than just seeing what you want to see or seeing yourself in, or choosing the one that you like, regardless of what sign you are, because it fits for you that day. It's more than that, I think. I think that there's something that people are responding to, perhaps subconsciously, that is about that. It's just that, which way is the wind turning today?
That also plays on the whole thing why horoscope columns got adopted by the popular press, because the magazines and newspapers that first led with astrology columns, particularly in the 1920s, were the ones that also had a lot of correspondence columns. They had a lot of, they all had problem pages. They nearly all had problem pages, which there's an overlap. In fact, some of the problem pages are found of the problems answered by astrology. So there is a big overlap there. But the point is that those sort of columns in the early magazines and newspapers are designed so you get direct engagement with the reader, so that you can participate. Instead of telling someone that on Monday Mercury will be square Saturn and that looks a bit like dull at the best of, you could tell, like some very early columns did that sort of thing. But if you say you people born at this time, then you're actually building a connection, which is a different thing. So that seems to be a lot of the reason why the columns took off in that way, because people, it allows them to engage. And what, unfortunately, what some astrologers are doing is actually blocking that early engagement with astrology. They're putting people off learning more about it and getting more involved in it. So they're shooting themselves in the foot. They want more people to take it seriously and learn more about it, but they're blocking participation because people aren't participating in the precise way, in the precise order they think they should.
One issue we have, and you'll know how serious this is now, but it's not that long ago that I discovered that many astrology columns, the horoscopes, were not actually being written by astrologers because the editors didn't rate it and weren't prepared to pay for an astrologer. Is that still happening?
That's never happened. I mean, obviously it has happened sometimes. Of course, yeah. I'm not going to say it never happened, but the majority of columns have always been written and still written by astrologers. Sometimes there's a middle ground where a journalist who's written about other stuff comes in and is offered the astrology column as well, and they go off and learn astrology too. I've actually taught journalists who have been landed with a job and didn't know astrology, so they learn the astrology to do it. There will always be the occasional one written by someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, but they are a very small minority. One thing I've been doing recently is, because I'm working on horoscope columns rather than just general sun sign astrology now, is identifying early columnists, finding out who they are, where they came from, because knowing the people behind it makes it a lot easier to work out how various things connect together. And it's become apparent that almost all columns are written by someone who knows their astrology.
Good.
And sometimes you do get people, magazines or newspapers starting a column with someone who doesn't know what they're on about, and it runs for a short time, and they get an astrologer in after a couple of months. That happens quite often as well, that they sort of realize actually we need someone who knows what they're doing there, because if you don't sort of write to patterns, I mean, you've done it, you know, it's actually much harder to make it up and keep track of what you're saying than to do it properly. It would be a lot more work, because I mean, remembering what you said 6 weeks about what Virgo was doing that Wednesday, I mean, you'd have to be constantly going back in your files, whereas if you're actually following the patterns and writing about them, you know what you were saying, you know where you were going with it, you don't have to keep checking. So the longer you write a column, the easier it is when you enter into the patterns of how the planets are relating to the sun and how things are moving along, the shapes they're making. Just inventing it is very difficult.
I would think so, and I'm reassured because I came across quite a bit of that maybe about 10-12 years ago, and I was horrified when I came across it, but it seems that you have a much more optimistic experience of this. Yeah. So I'm delighted to hear it. Something you mentioned there was linked to other traditions as well, and you used the word lore, and I like that. I like that because you come across it in other traditions related to, let's say, the Druids, etc. So how is there an overlap somewhere, or are they distinct?
Yes, there is an overlap. It depends what period we're talking about. Today, we tend to have things, like I said before, in boxes and in categories. So everything's very separate, but that is quite a recent phenomenon. So in the past, things like moon lore, weather lore, which was associated with astrology, but not astrology as we normally think about it, and it was actually a separate thing. The same person would often do these things. They might have another skill, they might read palms, they might tell fortunes, they might do a dozen different things, or they might sometimes might have done medicine or kind of some sort of therapy. The word wouldn't be used then, but they would effectively be offering some sort of therapy or counselling, even though they'd use different words to express the idea. But in the past, I don't know, let me think, probably since the end of the Second World War, I think we're really talking about things have come into little boxes. They're all being divided up. It started before then, but we really started categorizing things. So it's quite easy nowadays you can meet an astrologer that has no knowledge of any other related fields, even in a cursory way. And they will sort of tell you that palmistry is rubbish or something else is. I'm not making a case for palmistry, it's just the easiest example. I'm not bothered one way or the other, but they will, you know, that's all rubbish because astrology is clever and scientific. Whereas in the past, things were just all related. Astrology was the backdrop. Astrology provided the structure for a whole load of different fields of divination, of therapy, of characterization, of a whole load of stuff. And astrology was always there in the background. So you might do any one of these fields that use an astrology and not call yourself an astrologer. Nowadays, an astrologer does astrology.
But you can see the overlap even in things like the imagery of tarot.
Yeah.
You know, with
yeah, tarot is a bit difficult though, because that's such a recent thing. I mean, it doesn't go back beyond the 19th century, and I know the original cards go back to the 1500s, but the practice as we now do it is very much 19th century thing. So,
but it nevertheless, you can see the overlap and the imagery.
Yeah, sure.
There, and so I think it's perhaps what we are suggesting in our conversation or doing is we're saying we need to be more open to the popular stuff, the stuff that's,
I think it might help if you start talking about astrologies rather than astrology. Then we so recognize that there's more than one way of doing it, and although your way might be your good way, it's not necessarily that person's good way of doing it. They work in a different way. It works for them. I think the idea of describing astrology as real astrology against the other astrology is a bad one, because they're all real. You might not think one's as good as another. You might have your own value system where you think this works, this doesn't work, I don't like that, or whatever. That's fine. People's parameters will be in slightly different places, that depend on their experience and what they've learned, but they're all real. Yeah.
You know, there is something else as well that I think is a trap that we could easily fall into, and that is this idea that because there's only one correct way of doing this, or one correct way of looking at this, that we must suddenly be, it feels to me like a move towards the beginning of regulating astrology.
Yeah.
And I don't feel comfortable with that.
Well, there have been attempts to do that. I mean, there's been various astrological organizations that have prevented some, is it the Professional Astrologers Organization? I forget what it's called. There was a period when you couldn't sit on the board if you wrote horoscope columns for a mass publication. You were actually banned. They had to change the rule because one person who was on the committee was offered a job doing that. So they either would have lost someone they needed, or they had to change the rule. And in the end, they changed the rule. But we've all read, the faculty have often had rules about how you practice astrology. People do that, but where it's turning over at the moment, I think, is people here are becoming much more aware of Vedic astrology and other astrological practices in that direction. And in the other direction, we've sold astrology to Japan, and the Japanese are becoming much more aware of Western astrology. So things are shifting. You can't now sort of just talk about the astrology that works and that only these people can do it, because the people who do it are different and they're relating to it differently.
And it's really important that we keep this open and that we avoid this, you know, it has to be done in a certain way. You have to prove that you can do it in a certain way in order to be able to call yourself an astrologer, in order to be able to practice this. Because in our attempt to raise standards, what we will be doing is we will be closing the door to innovation and cross-fertilization.
Yeah, yeah.
And that really would be the death of astrology, I think.
It's quite similar to when you're talking about music and popular music. And you know, this is really awful, we shouldn't allow kids to listen to this or whatever. But the arguments are similar, that like they're debates in the arts, this isn't proper music. Especially when you're talking about people who create pieces by sampling and on me DJ and stuff like that. And that's not real music. That's not, no, that's spoken word. So it can't be music. Music involves singing. You have to do it in this way. They're the same sort of arguments. They're exactly, okay, the subject's different, but we're approaching it in the same way. And it hasn't worked for music, it hasn't worked for various forms of art, it hasn't worked for literature. So there's absolutely no reason at all why we should think that that approach would work with astrology. We've seen again and again how it doesn't work.
It doesn't. And I think perhaps
perhaps gone down the wrong way, I think. Sorry.
Perhaps it's an issue of wanting to prove to the establishment that, you know, astrology is respectable. And I think that if we go down that road of trying to prove and validate astrology, we're going to lose our hearts. And that,
do you want to be respectful? I mean, really, you know, is this what we're going for? Like, let's all be respectable and get acknowledged, because a lot of people who start doing astrology in the first place are doing it because it's not respectable and because it's not a standard belief. They've chosen it for that. But they engage with it because it's different and because it calls them in some way, and then they try to repackage it. So it becomes the thing that they were avoiding, which doesn't quite make sense to me.
essentially, I feel that astrology, for all of the fact that it has its roots deep in ancient knowledge and wisdom, and that it is astronomy as well, because of course it has to be. Despite that, it's a heart matter.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's appealed to people and survived persecution, you know, attempts to shut it down. It seems to be overriding the edict that it must be for entertainment purposes only. It's, you know, it will survive Richard Dawkins and his best attempts and all of the others because it appeals to the heart. And it appeals
and it has done for a long time. I mean,
exactly, it appeals to the heart because it rings true. We know it, we feel it, because it speaks of us and it is an expression of us. So we must always remember that.
Yep.
And that's why
and that's it.
That's why I like your book, because it's a very good reminder of exactly this, that it's something that speaks to the heart and that goes beyond reading old literature on the subject and beyond understanding Babylonian principles. It's because it's of us.
Yeah, I think we need to get rid of some of the assumptions that have been associated with astrology in the past century or so, which is that you need to do this way, this way, and it's for these people. And also the real astrology against mass astrology, it assumes some sort of power system where a trained person who is knowledgeable will always know more than better than you, the lowly ordinary person, and that can be a dangerous thing to get messed up in. Obviously, people who've learned more are going to know more, but they're not necessarily always better. It's not that they're going to be more knowledgeable, but being knowledgeable isn't always what you need.
You know, you can go to a doctor who absolutely brilliant and specialize in a particular area of medicine and come out feeling terrible, not heard, not understood. And that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Because there isn't a connection, because that doctor is being very mechanical in their approach and forgotten that in front of him or in front of her is a human being.
Yeah, there's a person there.
And I think that's what it comes down to. And we need to always remember that understanding what we understand, knowing what we know, is only the beginning. Then comes the connection, and that outweighs everything. And what you're talking about, perhaps, is people who are able to make the connection with a more limited palette to play with.
I think this is why it's useful sometimes thinking in terms of astrology as a language rather than a science or a skill, because you use a language to communicate with someone who has the equivalent language. And knowing the language doesn't make you cleverer, it makes you more knowledgeable in a certain way, and it allows you to make a connection. And I think that can be quite a helpful way to think about it, rather than is it a science or is it an art? And art, I'd go for the art argument every time anyway. But I think it sits better as a language, as a device for communication, as something to pass ideas back and forth. But it does go in both directions. It has to come from the other person as well.
I do feel that it's like a language. I often describe it as a language. It is a language which speaks of the human soul and the human experience. And it is a language that connects us with the cosmos and with each other, hopefully. So I think of it very much in that way. The mechanics are the means by which we perhaps access it and understand this knowledge. Perhaps, we can look at that, as the grammar, but, the concepts are there, and it can only be expressed through language.
Yeah, but I mean, we need an access point to be, to be able to connect. Yeah, certainly. So yeah, like a grammar, that it makes sense, but it also then gives you the problem, like with art, you can't describe why one song sings to you more than another one. You can't describe why using astrology in that way sings to you and you can relate to it, rather than doing it in that way. And it doesn't have to make sense in your brain all the time. It just doesn't need to. We do tend to think that if we can't categorize it and describe it and understand it with the rational parts of our brain, then it doesn't have any worth or value.
There's so much in astrology that leads us down this path. Which house system do you use? And do you tend towards a more prescriptive, traditional language when you're looking at a chart, or are you more open, in the language that you use? There's so much, and that's the beauty of it. It is a very broad and human experience, precisely because it's got so many possibilities.
Yeah.
Well, that's turned into a very philosophical discussion.
I thought we were talking about horoscopes. We went somewhere else. It's when you started off with chores, so I thought, okay, we're not doing lightweight today, are we?
I'm not sure I know how to do lightweight.
That's fine.
So, well, the book which has led to this wonderful philosophical discussion is called The True History of Sun Sign Astrology. And so I will be putting a link to that in the description box. And Kim, if people wanted to know more about what you're up to, how do they do that?
Well, I don't social media and website or anything like that at the moment because I have very little free time. But people can always email me. My email address is kim@kimfarnell.com. So it's quite an easy email address to remember.
Wonderful. That will be on the description box as well. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Anna. It's a pleasure as always.
And thank you all for watching. I will be putting up on my website some courses that I'll be doing very, very shortly. But in the meantime, next week, we're going to be doing more sun signs, but as well as houses in the context of healing. Until then, goodbye.